preparing for this message, I found myself wondering why we set aside a Sunday every year to focus on Christ the King. So, for your next game of church history Trivial Pursuit, here's a greatly consolidated version of the trivia. Pope Pius XI instituted the Feast of Christ the King in 1925 as dictatorships were on the rise in Europe. His motivation for doing so was the fact that secularism was rising and many Christians, including many Catholics, were beginning to express doubts about Christ's authority, and respect for Christ and the church was waning. Pius hoped that through the Feast of Christ the King, nations would see that the church has the right to freedom and immunity from the state, and leaders of nations would see that they are bound to give respect to Christ. He also hoped the faithful would gain strength and courage from celebrating this feast, as they were reminded Christ must reign in our hearts, minds, wills, and bodies. Christ the King Sunday is always celebrated on the last Sunday of the church year. In most years, that week falls on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, providing us an easy transition into Advent and Christmas. But this year, however, we find we have an extra week before Advent actually begins. But let's face it, based on culture and habit, in many ways we've already moved into the Christmas season. We celebrated Thanksgiving, survived or avoided Black Friday or Black Thursday, celebrated or endured the Apple Cup and the Civil War. It seems unusual not to see the Advent wreath in place and blue pyramids on the altar, when Christmas music is already playing on the radio and the stores are all decked out for the holidays. Yet here we are today contemplating a gospel passage from John that we traditionally read on Good Friday. It's an unusual and somewhat archaic festival that apparently used to be a big deal and is puzzling how to make sense of its place in our church here. What I want to talk about and offer this morning is how we might use this really important festival as a bridge to help us move into the celebration of Advent. Kind of a season of anticipation for the season of expectant waiting. During Advent, we prepare for the birth of Christ the King. Yet today, we remember his trial and death as recounted in John's Gospel. The prophecy from Daniel tells of dominion that would be given to one like a human being, clearly a reference to Christ. And the passage from Revelation speaks the promise of hope to a community in distress after Christ's death. Out of all this information, I see two things I think we can focus on this morning. First is how we can recognize that the kingdom of Christ is present even when it might clearly seem like it's not. And two, how do we help bring the kingdom of Christ to bear in the coming season of Advent? I think it's important to begin with the whole notion or whole idea that calling Christ the King may be antiquated, outdated, or confusing. However, Christ the King Sunday does have a much nicer ring to it than Christ our democratically elected leader Sunday or Christ comes out on top Sunday. Don't you think? But all kidding aside, one important concept that we gain from this celebration is that the kingdom is not a democracy. The kingdom is not a democracy. God cannot be recalled or voted out of office, and God is not an unjust or petty dictator. When we celebrate Christ the King, we are not claiming or celebrating an oppressive ruler. We are lifting up a human life lived out in love and mercy, teaching a kingdom of justice, humble service, and peace. Christ radically redefined and transformed for us the concept of kingship. When we look at how Christ lived out his life, what he taught, and how he expected his followers to act, I think we get a glimpse of how we can recognize the kingdom today. In the readings from Daniel and Revelation, we hear words of promise and hope spoken to two different communities in distress. In particular, the words from Revelation, grace to you and peace from the one who is and who was and who is to come,